You're listening to Two Beers Until Phronesis, a philosophy podcast for students, graduates, and anyone else interested in ideas. In this side series, we explore the history of philosophy and its most notable thinkers, from Socrates to Nietzsche, covering all the big ideas from the ground up. Enjoy!
Socrates. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview and just go through basically a quick catch-up session of Socrates and who he is and the basic broad points, and then we're just going to launch into a discussion and just kind of go through who this bloke was, why he was pretty cool, and all the rest of it.
That sounds really good.
So basically Socrates was a philosopher that sort of was around mostly during the sort of golden era of Greek civilization, or the Athenian civilization. He was born in Athens in around 469 BC and died around 399 BC. He lived during the Peloponnesian War, which I didn't say right. He lived during the Peloponnesian War, which basically put Athens into quite an unstable state. He is considered sort of like the father of dialectic, and he was one of the first, considered one of the first ever moral philosophers. He was I
think it's not too much of a stretch to say he's the first philosopher, but I mean, we get into that later. But yeah, I would say pretty much because obviously we just did the episode on the pre-Socratics. I think he's the first philosopher in a real sense of the word, in the way we think about the word now.
Right.
But yeah.
And we have, he taught Plato, he had many students.
A lot of the people as well in ancient Athens regarded him as the philosopher. They would actually refer to him as that. So he had this status as the sort of one and only.
Yeah. And as I alluded to earlier, he was then executed actually by the state. So he was executed by the Athenian state at the time, and that's how he sort of died. And we'll get into why that was and what sort of led to that. And, he was just sort of known as the guy with a wicked intellect, one of the first philosophers, etc. Is there anything else you want to sort of add to that brief overview of who this guy is before we...
Yeah, well, there's a few things, yeah. So the fact that we don't really know anything about him is the main thing I really want to bring up. I think that's such a big, important aspect of talking about Socrates, is that we know nothing really about it, because he never wrote anything down. And obviously we'll get into the reasons why. But it's interesting to note that most of the accounts we have from him are from Plato. And Plato's obviously got this massively biased view. And then you've got...
Xenophon.
Xenophon. Yeah. Fucking Aristophanes, the guy who wrote the Clouds play that lampooned him. But yeah, so it's important to kind of note that he's got this really controversial kind of... people don't know what to make of him.
Yeah, historically speaking, this is what's called the Socratic problem. So, and to sort of launch in the first stage of discussion, I suppose the historical... the historical background behind Socrates is fairly, loose and a bit ambiguous in the sense that we have multiple secondary sources. He didn't write anything, he didn't put anything down, and the trouble is that the sources can differ about the same sort of events in Socrates' life and the same aspects of his character. For instance, Xenophon might have a slightly different idea of who Xenophon was. Also a student of Socrates, who was also he was a mercenary, and he was a famous sort of commander in the Athenian army, and he wrote a lot about Socrates and his life and his death and things like that. And him and Plato are probably the two biggest sources, and obviously philosophers like Aristotle, who was taught by Plato, wrote a bit about Socrates. You have people like Aristophanes as well, who wrote comic plays. They more are caricatures of him.
Yeah, so Aristophanes wrote a play called The Clouds. And basically, it's just lampooning Socrates for being a dirty cunt, basically. They're just this guy is disgusting. He's just walking around in his bare feet, going up to people in the marketplace, bothering people, asking them weird questions like, what is virtue? Or what is justice? Or what is moral goodness?
Right. And so that's a lot of what made his character infamous, is he would just wander around the marketplace, and he would claim to sort of not really know anything, but he would constantly try to engage in dialectic with people and sort of ground down what they believe and go, well, why do you believe that? Well, if you believe this and you believe this, well, why do you believe this? And force them to sort of either a contradiction or to redefine what some of their foundational beliefs were. Hence, being sort of the father of this sort of critical technique, and this I think was now the Socratic method, if you like, to question down to the sort of axioms of what someone believes.
Yeah, and one way to think about that is, so I think he kind of stands out from the nationalism of the time, because a lot of the time he's confronting generals about ideas of justice. Because I think the Delphic Oracle told him that he's the wisest person in the world, but he was like, oh, that can't be true. In fact, he didn't go out to seek this information.
Yeah.
I think his students went out on his behalf.
It was one of his friends who went out to, her name was Pythia. She was like the oracle in Delphi, which was, at the time, Delphi was sort of like considered like the centre of the world. It was like this great holy place. And he sent his mate out because he was too lazy to go out. He just like sent his mate out to go ask the oracle about him and all that sort of thing.
Well, did he send someone on his behalf? Or did they?
I think
did
he
they
sent
take
on
it?
his behalf.
All right.
I think I'm not. I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he was actually interested in what the oracle wanted to say.
Because he wasn't that bothered about leaving Athens ever. Obviously, he did leave Athens because he was a soldier in the Peloponnesian War,
Right.
and he was a hoplite, a geezer with a spear.
Yeah.
And he used to fight people, but I think he was a stonemason as well. But like generally, he just didn't care about any of that kind of stuff. He just wants to walk around in rags and just annoy people. Is the general sense.
He was always very poor. He didn't acquire any wealth. He just kind of like lived a very humble life, if you like, in a sort of very deliberate way.
It sounds quite attractive, but then you hear him say things like, well, you should all be paying me for teaching you about virtue. And it gets to the point of like, because I used to regard Socrates as kind of a hero in this sense, especially when I got into philosophy. And then after about a year of studying, I was like, this guy's a bit of a prick, actually.
Yeah, although the problem is, and to go back to the Socratic problem and the problem with the sources, is like that sort of version of Socrates was a Platonic version of Socrates, the Plato's sort of idea of him as being, perhaps a little bit more parsimonious, a little bit more extreme than maybe he was. And you might, people like Xenophon probably emphasize more him as this person with ultra discipline and ultra sort of virtue, and like he wouldn't budge on anything. He was incredibly tolerant of pain. He would walk around in the snow without any shoes on and that sort of thing. And and you sort of have slightly different conceptions of the guy. So it's like as to whether that's as much of an exaggeration, whether he was as extreme as he was, or whether it was just he was a bit annoying and sort of went around questioning people. It's hard to exactly say.
I think every historian pretty much agrees that he's unique, and he seems to have been, at the very least, like a really eccentric character. And my take on the Socratic question is, I know you corrected me the other day by saying it was like a burden of proof. It's more like Occam's razor. It's like this idea that, well, a lot of the sources do seem to correlate.
There are correlations between some of the sources, right? I mean, the two big correlations, funnily enough, is that he was ugly, at least later on in his life, and he was also really, really clever. And like those are the only two things that we can say for sure that this guy kind of existed, and he was ugly, and he was really smart. And there's obviously that's lots of correlations on top of that. But yeah, other than that, you can kind of really sort of pick apart his character depending on who you're reading.
Yeah. So what else do we kind of roughly know about Socrates in terms of his character? Like,
well,
what
to
kind
sort of
of
continue on that story with the oracle and everything. So he sent his mate to this oracle. And this oracle went, like you said, he just goes, well, Socrates is the wisest of them all, basically, mirror, mirror on the wall. So his mate goes back to Socrates, goes, yeah, so she was like, yeah, mate, you're like, well, clever and all that. And he's like, yeah, but that can't be right, because I'm sure that there's someone else out there who must be wiser.
His head is as big as he's like, his ego is swelling at this point. He's like, oh no, that's not true. I'm not the clever. He thought he was the cleverest.
Right, and it's sort of like, and obviously depending on who you, because I think it was Xenophon's is the source of this story of the oracle story.
Yeah, so he sets out then to basically go up to generals and statesmen and basically say, yo, you guys are really wise. You must know what justice is because you're a statesman. You have to know what justice is. And then he'll like frame their ideas in such a way, put words in their mouth, and just basically just ask them why, like a child, until that they just can't break it down anymore.
To be fair, I would say there is a bit more to it in the sense that he would often try to get them to agree with propositions, for example. So he goes, so what is your conception of justice? So how would you describe justice? And then he would get them to eventually contradict their original description of what
Which is
they
very
said.
easy to do, though, because it's like most people don't think about it to this degree. And that's kind of why I think he's this great kind of poster boy for philosophy, because he really does want to get down to the fundamentals of a question. But then, at the same time, I can see why that would have been annoying in ancient Greece.
Yeah, and not only that, but like I think a lot of aspects of his character as well, I think are very appealing. At least, he would go to the death believing what he believed. He would rather die than stop doing his critical approach and questioning people. And he believed basically that he knew nothing after a while. So he was, so getting this news that, oh, you're the wisest of them all, he was like, well, that can't be right because I think that I know nothing, or at least I believe that the reality is that I'm, the wisest thing to realize is that I am, I don't have perfect knowledge of everything. And, and this sort of goes into one of his first sort of aspects of his philosophy, which was that with knowledge, you can gain better understanding of virtue, and it's with virtue, with understanding exactly what the perfect virtue is how you gain happiness. So he would think, well, virtue is the road to happiness, but the road to virtue is knowledge. So it's like knowledge is a virtue in a sense, because you to figure out how to be as virtuous as possible requires knowledge. That's one of his sort of foundational beliefs, was this idea that knowledge equals virtue equals happiness. But he also thought things like this sort of cave of ignorance idea that everyone did sit in this sort of cave of ignorance, if you like, and we all need to sort of be aware of that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's obviously something that Plato then took upon later in the Republic, this whole cave idea. And I think it's hard to say where the exaggerations end and the real historicity of the situation kind of continues, because you have this problem with some of the Platonic writings. So Plato, his student, writes later about Socrates, and I think really it was the death of Socrates that moved Plato to write in such a way about Socrates, so as not just to kind of continue his legacy, but to kind of venerate his death, to kind of get back at the people who killed him through
give justice.
And the early dialogues of Plato, it's like Socrates is pretty much, he's less exaggerated, so it's probably more likely that this is what Socrates was like. And then in the later dialogues, he's basically just espousing Plato's own ideas. But I think it's important to note that people would have known who Socrates was when Plato was releasing all these books. They'd have popped down to Waterstones, they'd have opened it up and gone like, oh, that's Socrates. Like, why is Plato? If it hadn't have been how Socrates had been, they wouldn't have been like, oh, why is Plato writing about Socrates in a way that just Socrates wasn't like?
Aquastonus.
Yeah, just completely. Is that the ancient Greek?
Ancient Waterstones.
Yeah.
I don't know what stone is in ancient Greek.
You just a stonus, yeah.
Aquastonus. Yeah, but so you're right there. So like that's a weird thing about if using Plato. Plato is probably the most accepted source for Socrates and his life and what he was like. But unfortunately, the way Socrates his character does change, and also writings like the Symposium are fictions, and most of what Plato writes are fictions which has the character of Socrates in them. That he's not necessarily always literally writing about Socrates. A lot of it is just Socrates representing a certain character or position in an argument. And like you said, the middle to late Plato, Socrates would take on all sorts of ideas, like for instance, like the form. So like one of Plato's famous ideas, which we won't go into now, we're going to the Plato episodes, Socrates begins espousing these ideas in middle to late Plato. But the problem is, early Socrates and a lot of the other sources of Socrates felt that he didn't really, he occupied essentially this position of doubt. So the idea that he would be comfortable with saying, well, the forms is the most truthful way to think is very questionable. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people sort of doubt that this middle to late Plato writing version of Socrates is necessarily very historically accurate. Like you said, probably just there as a caricature for Plato to express a lot of his ideas. And also bearing in mind, Plato was 24, I believe, when Socrates was executed. Let's get a bit of detail on the trial, actually.
Yeah, then we can move on to like some of Socrates' philosophy and stuff, and so he was put to death for corrupting the youth of Athens and sort of introducing other gods that weren't their gods.
Right.
And I think that's largely the context you have to see this in, is the fact that it was kind of a tumultuous time for Athens because they'd just been through the war. It was kind of hard time.
So it was about 3 or 4 years in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. Athens was in a real state because they just lost this war, right? They were so terrified of corruption, so terrified of all these sort of things. He would essentially he was accused, and this was still a trial with you had jurors. It was like 500 jurors, of random
Yeah,
Athenian
this
citizens.
really was democracy well, at least in the ancient Athenian context at work.
Relatively democratic,
Yeah.
But he was accused essentially of, and it was only three people accusing him. I think only really one of which we know much about.
It's just generals really pissed off
yeah.
because he humiliated them in the marketplace, basically.
Right, and I think a lot of people were a bit pissed off with Socrates for this very reason, that he was being a bit of an arse. He was just like, and I think these three generals in particular, I think one of them, he had sort of like, as he would put it, corrupted his son. He'd sort of taken him on his wing, and his son went around sort of doubting everything, if you like. So he was pissed off about that. He was obviously pissed off about how he sort of undermined a lot of these politicians and would sort of say, well, you don't know the absolute truth, and that he was accused, one, of sort of like impiety, which is just denouncing the gods and all that sort of thing. He was accused of also corrupting the youth, so he was accused of going on the streets and talking to random young people and going, hey, I'll take you under my wing and teach you all about doubt and and this sort of Socratic whatever. Although you wouldn't have put it like that, but you just said like, yeah, you know nothing, mate, and and that would have been his sort of foundation of his teachings. And yes, and people like Alcibiades was also a student of Socrates. So, and Alcibiades was a bit of an infamous figure in sort of ancient Athens. He lost a war in Sicily, and he sort of, although some historians might contest, well, he wouldn't have lost it if he was actually commanded. Blah 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 blah. Basically, he was like this guy who basically he'd gone to Persia, he'd gone to Sparta and fought for Persia and Sparta and all these places. He was a deceptive character. People didn't like him, and he was also and that was another argument about like, well, Alcibiades was sort of your spawn, if you like, you're a product of you. And so that was, level. He was also associated with pre-Socratic philosophers like Anaxagoras, who we mentioned in the pre-Socratics episode. And sort of mocked this idea that so Anaxagoras believed that the sun is a giant ball of fire in the sky. God, what an idiot! We all know it's the gods. And so it was like, and obviously. Socrates was associated with Anaxagoras, and so that sort of impiety again by association. And Pythagoras as well. He was also sort of associated with that sort of like sophistic tradition in a way. And like, obviously the weird thing is a lot of like, Plato and Aristotle actually hate sophists or hate that sophistic tradition of...
I think sophism really is kind of like the manifestation of this form of democracy that Plato wants to kind of tackle in using the character of Socrates and kind of giving justice to the character of Socrates, because obviously the sophists are just like lawyers. They just go around basically winning arguments for people. Basically, if you want your kid to be a statesman, you send him to the sophists, you teach him how to argue, and sophists will argue any position. They're just like rent-a-gobs. They're like Katie Hopkins in ancient Athens. And I kind of think that it's that moral relativism of these sophists that Socrates really stands against.
Yeah. But this is the thing, and he was associated with a lot of them, of course, like he didn't like this idea. So maybe a bit of guilt by association. There was this idea of he was corrupting the youth and that he was impious. And those were the three that but more or less, the main reasons were some people took it really personally. There was probably a lot of people who pissed off, and it ended up in the trial with 500 jurors. And yeah, this became known as the Trial of Socrates.
Yeah, and then he starts it's a nominal charge. I think they just want to get rid of him for any reason. I think that's the historical consensus. I think they're just using this charge of impiety and everything because they're just pissed off with him. And I think the guy's like 74 at this point, which is really old for ancient Athenian society. And like, instead of trying to argue his case or going, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry," which is, I think a lot of historians have argued might have actually got him off. He had quite a good chance.
No, he had a very good chance of getting
it.
But the problem is also we have conflicting sources again.
Yeah.
So we have Xenophon, again, like a student of Socrates, who was a warrior, blah, 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 who sort of wrote afterwards, well, Socrates, I think Xenophon actually wrote that he didn't say anything, or didn't mount any defence, whereas you've got Plato sort of saying that he mounted this great defence and this great sort of origin. And it's difficult to say whether, like, maybe Plato put words in his mouth, maybe a lot of it is dramatised. But either way, it's like the legacy or the idea of the Socrates defence and the fact that he was sort of principled to the end, I think, is what sort of lives on and what sort of became, the sort of known history of him, I guess. However accurate that was, even before the trial happened. So he had a chance, because they actually, there was a delay between him being prosecuted and him actually going to trial. And in that time, he could have perfectly easily escaped or left Athens with, his friends could have helped him out of Athens easily. But what's really interesting is he sort of, he went and consulted I think it's called a daimon, Greek equivalent of your soul or yourself. It's not really like the soul because the soul sort of changed with the definition. When Christianity sort of came in, our definition of the soul kind of changed religiously. But
it's not that metaphysical.
It's more like a self, if you like. And Socrates believed that, and he sort of consulted with himself, his conscience, if you like, and he went, well, and Xenophon will say, well, one of the big things that he would never do is never go against his conscience, and his conscience told him, don't run away, and he said, well, okay, I'm gonna stick around. I'm just gonna face the trial. I know that I should probably run away if I had a chance to live, but like you said, maybe there was rational reasons, like, well, I'm old and I don't have any money, and I probably
So he's 70. He's like 70 odd. So that's going to be a big factor in why you wouldn't want to choose exile, because I think exile was like pretty much on the cards. Because a lot of the students also, because once the sentence was passed, he had to drink hemlock. And commit suicide in that way. He was forced to. But his students were like, we can sort of break you out here and, let you loose. And I think there's several reasons maybe why he didn't. And I think part of it is he's old. He just didn't want to. He would have had these principles and carried them onto the next town, and they would have annoyed him as much as one of the, he would have carried on annoying people and probably had the same sentence there. And ancient Athens was probably the best place he was going to get away with this. If he couldn't get away with it in Athens, he couldn't get away with it anywhere.
Yeah, and he lucked out many times. In fact, it was the vote wasn't even that. It was quite a close vote. It was something. It was 500 jurors. I believe the difference was about 30 votes.
Oh really?
Between him being guilty or being completely acquitted. But probably what built the difference is during the trial, part of his defence. So back in ancient Athens, you could basically you'd make your defence, you'd make your thing, and he makes this grand speech we might go into in a minute. And then afterwards, the vote was cast, and it wasn't that it was fairly close, maybe 30 votes difference. And then you have the option democratically to give another way that you could give another punishment. So he could say, well, I think a more fair punishment would be a fine, or I think sources kind of differ on this again, but like essentially, the famous thing that he sort of says is, well, my punishment should be that I should get free meals from you guys because I've been doing you a service. So he's just been like convicted. He's his everyone wants to kill him, and he's been given another chance to like go, well, I think this is more maybe exile, maybe another chance to say, or exile, I think, or a massive fine, or exile and fine. And he just goes, no, I've done you a service, you should be paying me.
Yeah, exactly.
And then and obviously after that the vote was quite unanimous for him to be put to death. And then back in those days they were still crucifying people, so that was crucifixion was actually a very common form of execution. So he was actually quite lucky to have the whole hemlock situation.
I think one of the other reasons maybe why he chose that is because he has a belief in democracy or the state, so he wants to say that, well, if this is what the people have decided, then I'll go for it. And that could be another factor. I mean, I don't know.
Really. It said as part of his speech, he sort of said, well, I'm not worried by this because, I will be goaded to death by the state because I'm born in this society that obeys the laws of the society, and that sort of thing, and I believe in upholding those. As you can sort of tell just from this, like, he was quite the character, and he was really sort of like, wouldn't sort of change on his principles or his beliefs, just, even when it came to sort of the end. But at the same time, there were rational reasons as well why it might have been a good time for him to go out and a good time for him to leave. It's not necessarily that it was entirely this just, completely bleak situation for him, considering his age and everything. And also during his trial, and this is, a big point, thing, when he's mounting his defence, obviously, one of the accusers will sort of say, well, you've been doing all this, and he would come up, and part of his defence, he would just totally, destroy this guy in a debate, totally, outplay him with rhetoric and whatever, and it was, he sort of almost make fun of them and be just totally brutal in his in how he dealt with these accusations levelled against him and everything, which probably would have helped him with the vote and everything. But
I don't think he was. I don't believe he was half as witty as what Plato wants to make out.
Yeah. So the ideas of Socrates and what the sort of philosophies were that at least he was attributed with by some people.
I think one of the most important is this idea of the Socratic method, just to get a sense of the kinds of conversations he's having. So what exactly the Socratic method is basically just questioning people, getting right down to the fundamentals. It would say, like, what is virtue? Is it teachable? These kinds of questions. And really get people to think about the kinds of beliefs they were holding. And to the point where they'd be like, oh, I'd never even thought about the idea of good or something. And obviously, famously in like things like the Republic, his interlocutors get like really angry. I just think you would really if someone's coming up to you going, "Hey, what is virtue? Is it teachable?" You'd be like, "Go away! I'm trying to like buy stuff down the Agora. Like, go away."
Right. But he was very, like you said, virtue focused. I mean, he believed that committing injustice was far worse than actually suffering an injustice. So, if you were, say, suffering some like false conviction or something, where people are beating you for whatever, no real reason, he thinks that's a less worse fate for you than, say, you actually committing that very injustice. And he thinks that because it's all about maintaining, a good soul. I'm using that word again, but it's not strictly the word that they would sort of use, your daemon, your whatever they call it.
Yeah.
Your soul would get corrupted by the act of committing this injustice, and thus it is, he would say, well, if these people are committing injustice to me, I may feel bad about it, but at least it's not corrupting my soul, and they're going to be worse off for having done that, because it's not virtuous to have done that. That was sort of like one of the foundations of his ideas about virtue.
Yeah, so he thinks that like being good is being virtuous. And part of the Socratic method is because he basically wants to get to the good. It's analogous to this idea of the good anyway. He calls it elenchus, or however you say it in the correct pronunciation. But it's basically this. One of the idea of truth, basically. But in terms of how you live your life, he basically wants to say that you should seek eudaimonia. So just as a conversation to try and seek this elenchus, a life should seek eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is essentially flourishing. So he thinks that virtue should lead to this idea of flourishing.
Right. And which is all sort of like, flourishing, happiness, this kind of idea of like the ultimate goal for where you want to be.
Yeah.
Like I said, and like I sort of alluded to earlier, the way to figure out what the good is and what the ultimate virtue is and how to get there, he believes was through knowledge. And to gain knowledge, you have to constantly be questioning and constantly be in dialectic and constantly like engaged with people to try and figure out the truth of whatever the matter is. And that's what he firmly believed in. He didn't believe that he knew what the good was, but he wanted to find out what it was.
Yeah, and I think he has this idea that process of finding out, so having a conversation about virtue is basically the best thing that a person can do. So that's why he gets off on it. He's always turning up at parties and symposiums and trying to get people to think about these kinds of questions.
And like he says, he also believes that if pursuit in life is, if a lot of what you're doing is bad, or it's not, it's not in pursuit of the good or the virtue, or if you don't think that you are, you think that you're pursuing what is good, but you're misguided, then you're going to be unhappy. And this sort of leads to one of those other ideas, which I think is a pretty cool idea, which is the idea that evil comes from ignorance, not from just from ignorance of virtue.
Yeah, so he thinks that those people that do wrong are literally just ignorant.
Yeah, they don't know they don't know what virtue is, so they're not committing an evil act.
Which I think is to pass the buck a little bit. Like that's avoiding the issue. Kind of, I don't know.
To an extent, it's quite a modern interpretation. If you think about how we are kind of to a great extent a product of our environment and our biology, and to how much can you blame? It's sort of this idea of Platonic determinism, which we'll sort of get into maybe in another podcast. But it is an idea that's very much stuck around and for a very long time. This idea that there's something called Hanlon's razor. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but this is simply what can be attributed as ignorance should not be thought of as malice. So if somebody does something awful, you should give them the opportunity to assume that they did that in ignorance and not out of genuine malice, or not because of any kind of actual evil.
I can certainly see
whether that's actually always the case. I don't know, and I don't necessarily think so. But you can see how at least it's the start of that idea that like at least we can start thinking about people, not in terms of people just do bad things and just do good things. There's also this uncertainty in the mix.
And I can certainly see why that would be an attractive idea. I mean, trying to think of like bad things that people do, like people mugging people. It's like, to an extent, you've got to be, I don't know, you've got to feel a certain way. You've got to, like, talking about Levinas the other day, and obviously it's that whole shutting off of one part of your mind to cause harm to another. You've got to kind of ignore. So you're talking about ignorance, you've got to kind of ignore the fact that they're human.
Right.
Which I think is one element of it. But I think Socrates almost wants to say that you're just stupid. I don't know. I think there's certainly an element of truth in that idea, and it's easy to see why he would have thought that back then. But yeah, so this idea that ignorance causes, people do things out of ignorance, and he also wants to say that if you're being ignorant, if you're not kind of thinking and being contemplative, he thinks the contemplative life is the best life, and he thinks the unexamined life is not worth living. So if you're a yob on the street and you're not really thinking about anything, you're just going around spitting at people and being unvirtuous, he wants to say that your life's not worth living.
Right. And that sort of almost ties into his one of the other, in a modern context of us being in a democracy, probably a more controversial idea, that he hated democracy. I mean, he hated the idea that everyone could get a vote. And it was, by everyone, I mean, this is ancient Athens, so we're talking every citizen that was eligible to vote and not women.
Yeah,
so
a citizen, slaves, i.e. a certain type of man
exactly.
that isn't a slave.
Yeah. But for what it was, even then he thought, well, the only people who should be allowed to vote should have to contemplate it for a long time and really think and thought about why they're voting and what they're voting for and all that sort of thing. And for that reason, he was like, well, democracy is bad because you've got so many ignorant people voting and whatever.
I'm not sure how much of that was Socrates and how much of it was Plato.
Yeah, again, it's hard to say. It's hard to say exactly.
I can definitely see, especially with Plato's Republic, which is a very elitist. I mean, he wants to let women be soldiers, but apart from that, it's very elitist. He wants philosophers to rule, and I mean, we'll get onto Plato's Republic in the next episode. But yeah, I kind of feel like there are better reasons for Plato to use Socrates in that way. I feel like Socrates would have been quite chill. I don't think he would have. I don't think he's. It seems like he's not the kind of guy that would have spoken down or judged people. I think that most of the judging is inferred by getting people to realise that their own stupidity, rather than outright saying you're stupid. He wants to show you how you're stupid. You show yourself how you're stupid. And it's like, I can see, like,
but you can see, because again, it's like, this is the problem, is like how much of the sources that are sort of on the other side of the table, like we mentioned, the comedies, sort of mocking and sort of him out to be this guy that just constantly like going, well, the clouds are what causes the rain, not the gods. And that was a joke. Like back in those days, somebody to say the clouds were what caused the rain and not the gods. That's like like, what are you on about, mate? That's ridiculous. It's the gods that bring the clouds that cause the rain. Mocking him for this idea that he sort of could come up with explanations for things, or this slandering him, as Plato would put it, for being impious, and all these things that did potentially lead to his trial.
It's like, for him to be used as this big figure, how much can we mythologize him? How much can we make him into this? Because he's supposedly like never gets drunk, and it's so a lot of the like in the symposium where he just like drinks like gallons of alcohol, just like totally fine. Everyone else is fucking wankered, just like on the floor, and he just walks out and he's like, no, I'm fine. I kind of want to take on that idea of Socrates. Like, I feel like it's useful. It was very useful for me learning philosophy to kind of have a window into the world of philosophy. Like reading about Wittgenstein, it's like, this bloke sounds like a twat. Like, I don't really want to. It's like Hume. I can't relate. He
sounds like a brand of vacuum cleaner, doesn't he?
Yeah. So I guess what I'm asking you is, do you think that he's the best kind of example of this kind of thing? Do you think he's the prime example of what it means to be a philosopher?
Well, for better or for worse, he became it in a way. He sort of became that cultural significant figure who brought dialectic and brought the idea of doubting oneself and constant criticism. And that's sort of like I said, it's kind of mythical. It's kind of real. We know that there was a Socrates almost definitely, and he had certain traits about him. He almost definitely did certain things and was probably almost definitely put on trial and was almost, but it's like, you know, the details of him and the details of what he believed and where is where it, you know, it can get very foggy. But at the end of the day, what sort of survives is the idea, or at least the philosophical idea that seemed to have had its genesis with Socrates, and that idea being the Socratic method, that idea being this sort of tradition of philosophy kind of beginning, or at least, you know, really having its roots starting with him.
Yeah. There's a quote by Christopher Hitchens. Goes something like, I think he was talking on radio to somebody about the historicity of Jesus, whether Jesus existed or not, and I think he basically says, well, let's not bother talking about Jesus, because let's talk about Socrates instead. So he kind of offers up Socrates as like this alternative to Jesus almost, and he basically says that Socrates is the best because he's having the only conversation worth having, and he's a relevant ideal that is worth taking inspiration from, because he kind of has the moral courage to think for himself, and that's just like such a powerful idea and very needed in today's society.
Yeah. And
the fact that he existed or not doesn't really matter so much as it does in Christianity with Jesus. And I remember reading that and kind of thinking, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any danger of people starting to worship Socrates or anything like that.
But I think fundamentally there kind of is a bit of a contradiction if you start worshipping Socrates, and I think that's partly why it doesn't really make sense to equate. So why don't we just worship Socrates instead of Jesus, or do this sort of thing? Because it's totally different sort of situation. I mean,
you can tell that to the Buddha, because I mean, the Buddha explicitly did not want to be worshipped. Like before he was dying, he was like, mate, if you do one thing, like just make sure nobody worships me and nobody like turns me into this weird thing that sticks my image everywhere. And
but like Socrates almost was on a fundamental level. His entire sort of history and behaviour and the way he sort of acted was, you know, sure, there's ideas about virtue, but it was fundamentally founded in doubt. And I think that you can't really found a sort of religious following around a figure who is entirely sort of the personification of doubt in a way and critiquing oneself. That doesn't work as a...
Yeah, I think I think you've completely hit the nail on the head there, because that was when you were talking to me about humanism, what the big problem with it, the fact that it's got this potential to turn into a religion or something worse. The way I wanted to kind of confront that was to make it about doubt, to make it about rejection of narratives, but to make doubt a positive thing. And I think that's what basically Pierre Hadot wants to talk about. It's a similar kind of thing where Pierre Hadot is a philosopher who writes about the genealogy of the way that philosophy is developed through the years. And he has a very specific idea of what philosophy is, but he starts with Socrates and basically ends with some of the existentialists, and he basically wants to say this is what philosophy is. And it's this type of inquiry and curiosity and doubt that he thinks can be embodied as not just something you do, but the way you are. It's your person. It's a transformative practice, just going around doubting everything. So I think that's probably what I want to say about Socrates in terms of what kind of a role model he can be. And I think it's probably something I've tried to take on. I think of all the philosophers, I think he's probably the one I've got the most, probably resonate with the most with. But again, I'm not really resonating with Socrates. I'm resonating with an idea of Socrates that I've made.
And I think, part of the problem is I can sort of feel that as well, but part of me worries that, the reason why I feel this resonation is because he's sort of a bit of an empty vessel, but not in the strictest sense, but in the sense that he is comfortable in his doubt. It's not like, when you say read Plato or whatever, you're like, well, I don't really agree with the forms, or, maybe I think there's an updated version of like some of his aesthetic ideas or ontological ideas. There's a lot of it sort of dated, and that's kind of cool that he wrote all this stuff. But the thing with difference with Socrates is he sort of almost, apart from what Plato kind of associated him with, which he may or may not have believed, he's kind of just like a bit of a blank slate and a bit of more of an idea of how to engage with interlocutors and how to make a dialectic, and I think that helps him become much more relatable, simply because you can put yourself into the idea of Socrates rather than a philosopher who had a very specific voice or a very specific character who brought a specific thing to the table. You may or may not strictly agree with everything that particular philosopher says, and often many of the later philosophers really start to have a lot of broad thoughts on things, a lot of thinking that really starts to pollinate out into all aspects of philosophy and even sort of the proto-sciences, if you like, when they were starting to study the world. And I think that does definitely help with Socrates.
Well, I think there's also this idea that he really lives his philosophy, and something that's probably, I think when people tend to think of philosophy, and this is why I think he's good for basically getting other people into philosophy that maybe not be into philosophy, they might not know anything about it. Because they might think it's this abstract thing, and obviously you've got the whole Socratic irony element where he's basically walking around, he sees what the pre-Socratics are doing, or at least that group of philosophers that were doing kind of the more rational, the more scientific stuff, and they're kind of doing all this proto-science, and he basically just wants to say, although all this thinking stuff's really hard, I'm just going to concentrate about virtue. I'm just going to do that, and he wants to cultivate a kind of craft. He wants to kind of believe something and live it, even if it's just the belief that he has no beliefs or something. But then on the other hand, it's kind of like, I can see how this idea is leaked into philosophy in universities and stuff. The Socratic irony. Oh, science is really hard. Let's not think about that. Let's just talk about moral questions. And I can just imagine somebody from like a STEM field reading Socrates and going, oh, this guy is responsible for why everybody hates science, because it's Socratic irony. It's not, you're not meant to really believe that science is too hard to do. I think Socrates also thinks he's fulfilling a very particular role in society. I think that's something that comes across. I don't think he expects everybody to live like him. I think he wants
to try and better people, or at least help them on the way to virtue, or try to help himself and them on the way to figuring out what the good is, what the virtue is.
He thinks he's a midwife in terms of teaching. He says, I'm only a teacher insofar as a midwife delivers a baby is teaching them. I'm just pushing you a little bit towards truth or whatever.
It's almost like he's pushing them towards heuristics, and he's enabling them to teach themselves to, I guess, in a way, to concern themselves with their own thoughts and criticise them, the structuring of thinking and that sort of thing.
I think the appeal for Socrates as a philosopher is also somewhat niche. I think he's very much like the revolutionaries philosopher, because he just challenges the status quo so much in the way he acts, the things he wants to say. There's nothing about him which kind of stays within the status quo. Most people who are into philosophy already kind of find the guy quite compelling, but then I think some of the other people who maybe are still into philosophy, but they're very much into the more ideological stuff, I think they kind of have a problem with Socrates more so than some of the other people would. But I just wanted to end my contributions with a quote from Richard Kraut, which is probably one of my favourite quotes about Socrates, which is just that he remains, for all of us, a challenge to complacency and a model of integrity.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Just to end it, I think I'm going to say basically what his final words were. And basically, he's dying of hemlock. He's sort of being paralysed from the legs up, as Plato describes it. And these are his final words. He just says, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay it without fail." And that's all he says. Basically, Asclepius is the Greek god of healing. So what he's saying is basically, because he thought that, sort of death was a release or a cure for life in a way. And so he's sort of saying, well, I'm dead now, so we owe a good old tribute to the old god of healing for finally giving me death. So he's just like a little bit of a joke right at the end. And that's Socrates.